Thank you, Irina. I hope everyone has had a wonderful weekend, and I'm very excited for what today has planned and the entire Rebound Summit. So the beauty industry has been very resilient in the past, and we've all heard of the lipstick index, referring to the industry in times of economic hardship. And what we can't know for sure is the future, but we can really try to plan for it. So this Rebound conference will help us understand the different implications of everything that's affecting us, from key retail channels, the closures, social and economical impacts, and the new consumer perceptions. So I'm very excited for our first speaker, who is Jared Weiner from the Future Hunters. Jared is the Chief Strategy Officer and EVP of the Future Hunters, one of the world's leading futurist firms. He looks at emerging global trends and helps identify the strategic implications of those trends for influential companies. And he'll be able to give us a bird's eye view of how these current social and economical shifts are moving us into a new normal, and how we can pivot and adjust for the post-COVID world. Jared?
Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you, Irina. First, before I jump into the meat of this presentation, I just wanted to say hello to everyone who's out there right now. These are really, really disruptive times that we're all in. I think that what's happening in the environment today is affecting all of us in profound ways, both personally and professionally. So I hope that this presentation today, this event, finds all of you doing well, both in business and in life. I always want to open with that as I give remarks during this period, because again, there's so much happening right now. So I'm honored to be here today, as I said, and I'm going to speak going much more broadly than the beauty industry, although I think that everything I talk to you about today is going to have direct tiebacks to everything that all of you do on a daily basis. We are in a highly disrupted world. The work that we do is with every industry imaginable. So the trends I'm going to talk to you about today, the perspective I'm going to share with you, is something that is universal. And then I know that it's going to set the stage for things that you might hear over the next couple of days that are likely going to be even more targeted towards your industry. Now, I love the theme of this event, Rebound. I think that it's a great way to encapsulate how we all have to think. But I, in this presentation, would like to take it even further than that in my remarks and talk about a concept that we call escape velocity. And many people right now, believe it or not, and I'm surprised to see this in my work as a futurist, but many people are still under the illusion that somehow the world and business is in many ways simply going to return to the way it was prior to all of this. And unfortunately, while that thinking is tempting and convenient, it will not lead to sustained success. Instead, we think of this in terms of escape velocity. And in physics, and I'm going to get very nerdy with you a few times during this presentation, because that's what we do. But in physics, escape velocity refers to the minimum speed needed for an object to escape from the gravitational pull of something massive. And in this case, the quote objects are our ways of thinking, our ways of innovating, and our businesses themselves. And the massive body, the huge body with a gravitational pull that we are trying to get away from, is what I will call the pre-COVID-19 business environment. And that we can also call that the world that we used to live in. And all of the now defunct assumptions which are associated with that previous time. So in a way, it's like we have to take all of that old baggage and we have to get rid of it. And that's the only way that we can see objectively for the future that's unfolding in front of us right now. I'd like the main takeaways from this presentation today at the end of the day to be forward-looking, optimistic, and have a message of hope tied into them, certainly when it comes to the future of innovation in the beauty industry and beyond. And I want to talk about leadership and sustainable business practices. But before we get there, we have to start with an honest and somewhat sobering assessment of our current circumstances. Otherwise, I don't think we're going to be able to paint a complete picture for all of you. Now, I want to just start with an important caveat here. As a futurist, I have to have the humility. And I say this all the time. I've said this prior to this pandemic and everything associated with it. But I have to have the humility to acknowledge to all of you today that I can't absolutely predict the future with any real certainty right now. And no one can. And that is because, A, even the best epidemiologists, doctors, and people who are policymakers right now don't know the future trajectory of this disease itself. Will there be a vaccine? If so, when? What are immunity patterns? What are fatality rates? All of that. It's totally uncertain right now. So we are basically in the middle of a new wild sort of frontier. B, there is serious social unrest in many parts of the world right now that have been compounded by pressures that are already applied by the disease itself. And we'll be talking more about this in just a little bit. Political leadership in many parts of the world right now has been inconsistent, unpredictable, and in some cases volatile. So when we think about policy issues that might impact the broader business environment, they are huge question marks right now. There are a lot of things we don't know about. We don't know where things are going here in the United States. I live in New York. If you see me glistening a little bit right now, it's because it is probably 90 something degrees and humid. I don't know where all of you are calling in from. I hope you're having a more comfortable day. But we don't know anywhere really around the world right now what the future policy implications of all of this are going to be. And so at the end of the day, in summary, there are just too many unknown variables. So any futurist or economist who tells you that they know with certainty what is going to happen is leading you down the wrong path. We have to extrapolate what we do know and paint a picture of where the future is headed, but we don't know for sure, and we have to get that out there. Now, that all being said, there are observable truths that we can now know, that we can talk about, and that we know will have a profound and directional impact on the future for everything that all of you do. Now, the first immutable truth is that this crisis has definitely exposed countless businesses, and in some cases, whole industries, for either A, what I'm going to call poor business practices, or B, insufficient risk management or modeling. It is, to me at least, nearly inconceivable that so many seemingly successful or previously considered best-of-breed companies were pushed to the brink of mere survival only weeks after the outbreak of this pandemic. And it's true that some industries, for example, the restaurant business, operate on razor-thin margins to begin with. But many should have planned long ago to have enough runway to weather a major economic disruption and all of the uncertainty that comes with it. And they did not. So entire sectors have proven unprepared for what's happening right now. And unfortunately, a lot of this can be blamed on what we call short-termism or short-term thinking. This is one of the most critical things I want to talk to all of you about today. The thing that makes my job as a futurist perhaps more difficult than anything else, even during normal circumstances, is getting leaders of businesses to think 5 years out, 10 years out, or 20 years out. And oftentimes they are unable to do so. And this is likely because, in most cases, faulty reward structures that incentivize immediate returns to shareholders or other stakeholders of a business at the detriment of truly long-term and sustainable thinking. So a lot of companies, a lot of businesses suffer from this kind of short-termism, and now we are at an inflection point where that is actually causing existential harm to them. So the very essence of that flawed thinking has now been challenged, and this type of environment is what will ultimately separate winners from losers, the concept of survival of the fittest. We are living through it in a real-time experiment right now. It's as simple as that. And this is a process of evolution happening right before our eyes. Those who got it right or are getting it right in the immediate aftermath of all of this will be positioned for real and sustainable success in the future. Now, the second immutable truth is that this pandemic may be with us for a while. So again, as a futurist, I can't come on here responsibly and tell all of you that I think that this will be over by X time or by Y time. It's impossible. It may permanently affect business practices and consumer behaviors. And what the pandemic, even if it does sort of go away in the near term, the likelihood that we experience more disruptive events like this in coming years is greater than ever before because of two things. Number one, as we all know, the world is more globally, interconnected than ever before. Apologies. And that's because of globally interconnected supply chains, consumer travel, etc. And two, the environment, the natural environment, our ecosystem, is being degraded at an accelerated rate. So even if we don't have another pandemic like this, there are likely to be other disruptive events that will shake up business and shake up civilization or society. Many observers consider what we are going through right now to be the single most globally disruptive event since World War II, which that ended 75 years ago. So what does this all mean for you? What we are experiencing right now is the confluence of two things, which we in our shop call, one, the COVID multiplier effect, and two, the COVID accelerator effect. I'm going to spend less time talking to you about the former today. I'm going to spend 1 or 2 minutes talking about it now, and more time talking about the latter, that COVID accelerator effect. So let's talk about this multiplier effect very quickly. We know that there are powerful and in some cases volatile protests happening around the world right now. In the US, many of the protests have focused on issues of racial inequality and police brutality, but there have been anti-lockdown protests in many states. There are a lot of protests around the world in places like the UK, in all throughout Europe, in Hong Kong, in China, in parts of Africa, in Israel, in Chile, in Brazil, and in many other places around the world, some of which are likely represented by some of you on this call today. There is debatably more global unrest now than at any time in modern history. And as we evaluate all of this, we have to examine what the common threads are. And the first and most fundamental thread of all of this is that many people protesting in the US and throughout the world are young. So even when issues of protest revolve around things like race or racial inequality, the vast majority of protesters are millennials or members of Generation Z. So, young people have always been drivers for societal change, and they often protest with greater fervor and frequency than older populations. But something profound and different is happening here today. That's number one. We have to make sure we understand that these protests around the world are driven by youth populations. Now, 2 entire generations of young people right now are at serious risk of being, quote, lost for years, if not decades. Now, I'm not saying that. That's according to economists. Millennials in the U.S. face the daunting prospect of being less financially well off than their parents, which is the first time such a projection has really been made of any generation in modern history. And there are signs that Generation Z may face similar hurdles. Now, the final common thread here is the pandemic itself. Global lockdown measures have pushed many people out of the workforce entirely, and in other cases, people have been furloughed, are working from home, or have more time on their hands than ever before to sort of think about issues that might have bothered them previously, but that they just haven't had the time or energy to pursue, to protest about, to show activism for. So this is all disproportionately impacting younger populations, and this is what we call the COVID-19 multiplier effect. And it is exponential in its impacts. And in fact, in some ways, the pandemic itself is directly responsible for much of the unrest, as we call it, that we see today. So the current crisis has given millions upon millions of disenchanted young people more time. And time is that wild card variable that has caused a lot of them to become more active, not just digitally, but take to the streets in terms of their activism. And many observers today simply, they oversimplify the protests as single issue based. And this is not to undermine the gravity of those issues themselves, but taken in their totality, the protests represent something far more expansive than individual issues themselves. This multiplier effect has galvanized youth populations in ways never seen before. This crisis is unique. It is a biological threat, and it is global, and it is serving sort of as a critical inflection point for humanity. We are now interconnected as a biosphere and as a civilization, and there is no disputing that the underlying drivers of current youth disenchantment are cause for major concern. But, in my opinion, the move toward mass protest and hopefully seismic societal change could well be considered a source for genuine hope and positive thinking for the long-term future. Coupling the multiplier effect with what I'm going to talk about next, which is the accelerator effect, we are experiencing, I should say, right now, the early stages of what we might consider a system refresh or a system reboot for humanity. Now, that is a big, expansive concept. And we could spend a day just talking about that. But as we think about all of the negative things happening right now, I want to make sure that as we talk through this and as we finish up a little bit later, that we leave with a message of hope and positivity, because I think in many ways, looking at this with the glass half full perspective like that is what is going to drive innovation and drive business success in the future. We also should talk about the role of influencers. I know how critical influencers are in the beauty industry. And before the pandemic, in our shop, we examined how young people now have more direct opportunities requiring less permission from traditional gatekeepers, whether those are parents, teachers, or bosses, than any previous generation to earn significant income, oftentimes serving as influencers online. Digital influencers, vloggers, live streaming personalities, esports competitors, they've combined to become a megalithic block of social power. But during this crisis, many prominent influencers have either receded into the background or in some cases have actually modeled questionable behavior. So with more time on their hands, many new people are generating online and often personal or intimate content during lockdown. We may be seeing an evolution of online content creation where a greater percentage of young people move toward becoming active creators instead of passive consumers. So the credibility of many established influencers could come under the microscope during this crisis. When circumstances get tough, will those influencers, those people who have established themselves as influencers, whom young people truly look up to, will they provide support, guidance, or even productive distraction? Or will some prove to be little more than engines for attention and commerce? That is a very interesting question. I think a lot of influencers are going to be put under that microscope. And so as brands, if you engage with influencers, we have to start thinking about how did the role of those influencers evolve during this crisis, and how is online content generation in its totality evolving during this crisis? It is very important for brands to speak to the values of the consumer today and tomorrow, especially younger consumers. Issues of social importance and obviously sustainability, which has been key for a very long time, are going to have to underpin the way that we speak to these constituencies from here on out. And that includes millennial consumers, and it includes Gen Z consumers. And any of you who heard my talk a few years ago, or have heard me or any of my colleagues speak at any events, know that we focus a lot of our energy on the future of those generations, millennials and Generation Z. Now that's the multiplier effect. The second part of what I want to talk to you about, which I think has more immediate direct application for you, is what we call the COVID-19 Accelerator effect. We've been focusing for years on the likelihood that advanced technology will disintermediate large swaths of human labor. And what's interesting to me is that many of the events that I speak at, the entire focus of the event will be on labor disintermediation, artificial intelligence, or some theme related to that. And I'm amazed to see that there is such a spectrum. Some people or some business leaders are really, really bullish in their predictions and their preparation for advanced technology displacing humans in the workplace, while others seem to think that it is overstated or it might be a fantasy and that we are likely not going to see that level of disruption anytime soon. Well, one of the interesting things here, and by the way, that trajectory started with blue-collar labor disintermediation in areas like agriculture and industrialized capacities, and it is now moving into white-collar professions. So white-collar industries are the ones at threat of being disintermediated by artificial intelligence and other smart systems and robotics. What we are seeing today in real time because of this pandemic is the acceleration of that trend, which we have been talking about for years. It is the idea that because of current circumstances, because of consumer fears, because of workplace realities, we are now living in a world where in real time we are seeing the drive and the mandate towards having a more automated workforce manifest in front of us. So businesses will be forced to re-engineer their entire operations and supply chains and workforces to prevent future disruptions like this pandemic from completely putting them out of existence. And consumers, and I know you're going to focus largely on the consumer today and over the next few days, they are already rapidly adjusting to the realities of what I will call a post-pandemic world. Many will remain uncomfortable with human-to-human touch points in areas that include medicine, retail, food service, travel and tourism, public transit, ride sharing, etc., where automation can be equally, if not more effective. So fully distributed firms may very well become the new normal. And fully distributed basically means firms where the workforce is dispersed. They don't sit in one central hub or physical office. And we've been talking for years about the movement towards this, and now we're going to see it manifest across companies, across industries. We are seeing now great businesses figuring out in real time how to re-engineer their workforce so that they can get things done virtually and remotely. Now, let me just clear this off my screen. Okay. I want to give you the optimist perspective. When I talked about the multiplier effect, I tried to finish it with a thought that was really big about the future of humanity. So let's talk about that now in this context. A small but growing group of philosophers, scholars, and ordinary citizens have long supported an idea that's called post-work, which refers to a world in which at least some portion of the population is permanently displaced in the workforce and can no longer find employment, regardless of how willing and able they are. And at the core of this is the assumption that many people derive minimal satisfaction from their jobs, and the what I will call utopian belief that humanity would actually be better off if it weren't tethered to work as we currently define it. So the conclusion drawn is that humanity, untethered from work, would be freed up for the pursuits that give them the most intellectual and creative stimulation, culminating in a human renaissance of sorts. Now, what's really interesting about this is this idea in some ways has been laughed off prior to this. But I think all of you on this call today can relate either personally or to those who you know. As you see people with more time on their hands or who have anxiety about what's going on in the world around them, they are directing or redirecting their energy into creative pursuits or hobbies or interests that they either have never had time for or they've never had the ambition to pursue. So the amount of people I know that are becoming online content creators, that are pursuing musical interests, that are cooking, that are doing art. I mean, these are things that a lot of people always had excuses for not doing, and now they're doing it. So it's really interesting right now. Perhaps we are in the early stages of a major, what I'll call software update in evolution of both human identity and human purpose. And this, of course, will permeate all manner of enterprise and everything that we do. Now, the accelerator effect has been the most observable thing to come from all of this. Instead of me sitting here in front of you trying to predict a crazy new world, which is in many ways unpredictable, what we are seeing now is the acceleration of existing trends that we have talked about for a long time, some of which materialized years ago, some of which business leaders kind of shook their head at and said, that's nice, but it may not be as material for my business today. Well, all of these things are now accelerating and gaining momentum, and they are providing real opportunities for innovation, thought leadership, long-term strategy, and ultimately future-proofing businesses. So let's consider some of these. I'm going to go through them very quickly. Now, I want to just state another caveat here, which is that in our shop, we make up a lot of words. We invent language, and that's because for a lot of things that we see, we don't believe that existing language correctly gets at the concepts that we're observing. So some of the words that I go through with you in the next 2 or 3 minutes will be invented words. Things that have accelerated. Number one, what we call other sourcing, which goes beyond automation. It is smart systems, smart technology, robotics, basically disintermediating human labor. We just talked about it. And what does that mean for the future of automated retail? Well, we've talked about it conceptually for a long time, and now here we are in 2020 during this pandemic, thinking concretely about how retail is going to be permanently disrupted. That leads into contactless consumerism. Now, this is something we've tracked for a long time in places like South Korea, and it is the idea that consumers want fewer human-to-human touch points. And they want retail to be more experiential, and they want the whole consumer ecosystem to be more experiential in many ways. This ties into a revolution in design. In the previous economy we were in, which we called the metaspace economy, we identified that there were about 10 really major growth areas for that economy. And that economy really emerged around the time of the last recession in 2007 and 2008. And one of the areas we've been talking about for well over a decade was what's called design space, and the fact that design thinking would be critical to underpinning the success of any business or organization. And oftentimes, people who are not in the design world sort of chuckled at that and said, design is nice, but we have other business realities to focus on. Well, right now, we are seeing a revolution in design. We've talked about this for a long time, and it is at the forefront of all businesses. The design or redesign of consumer products and all manner of the built environment, which includes retail environments and offices. How do we re-engineer them to optimize human factors? We also have the new logistics realities, autonomous vehicles and delivery drones, which will disintermediate people in the supply chain so that we can get products to people more efficiently, faster, and in some ways, in a way that people trust more. The imperative for more integration of technologies like augmented reality and virtual reality in sectors like beauty. In my presentation a couple of years ago, we talked about AR and VR, and it seemed conceptual. But now as people do more of their consumerism, I'll call it, virtually and remotely, we have to think about how to integrate these technologies in ways that make sense and make the consumer experience better. There will be a resurgence in the utility of 3D printing as a means to produce goods on demand in real time and free of human contact. Verflex, a concept we've talked about for almost 20 years, virtual and flexible working arrangements are now becoming mainstream through fully distributed workforces. We just talked about that. Telemedicine and the extension of that, which we call telewellness, where the potential applications are limitless. How do we approach people's physical, spiritual, and mental health from a sort of remote and digital perspective? So telewellness, this is becoming a huge growth business. What are the social consequences of job loss? For example, the post-workist theory I just talked about. Will whole segments of the population become more creative and in the process become interactive and digital content creators? Impacts on the ecosystem of influencers could be profound, and we already talked about how the opportunities there are tremendous, and this will impact all brands in the beauty ecosystem. Trust as the new luxury. We said this years ago. We said that if you define a luxury in economic terms as something which is in extremely high demand and extremely short supply, then what is the number one luxury for people in their lives today? And oftentimes we get two answers now. Time, people don't have enough of it and they need more of it, or trust. We are living in a world dominated by lack of trust, fake news, etc. And we have to figure out, how do we optimize trust? I'm about to wrap up. I was just going through my list of trends that I think are really important. And I think basically the bottom line here, and what I want to wrap up with, my important, sort of the optimistic part of this, is that we are going to see what we call templosion in innovation. Templosion is a word that we have defined as the implosion of big things happening in smaller and smaller chunks of time. And so we think that innovation is going to happen more rapidly and in a more exciting way than ever before. And the term innovation has long been co-opted to mean progressing in a linear way, to sort of taking what we already know and making stepwise improvements to it. It's very, very linear. And we challenge everyone we speak to, and this is more important today than ever, to not think about innovation the way that everyone else does, but to think about imagination and reimagination. How do we imagine and reimagine the future of our companies, our sectors, and our own lives and careers? If we were to remove any perceived impediments or obstacles, how would we reimagine the future of it to be, and how do we want the future of it to look? This is an exciting time for that, because for the first time in memory, current circumstances are forcing businesses to adapt by the day. And all of the bureaucratic obstacles and all of the things that used to take years when it came to research and development and getting permission to do things, that is now taking months. What used to take months is now taking weeks. We are seeing successful companies, or the ones that will survive all of this and thrive, we are seeing them bolster innovation in real time. It is what I call innovation on steroids. It is true imagination and reimagination. It is the imperative. I often end with a quote in my regular presentations from Albert Einstein, where he said that logic will get you from A to B, but imagination will get you everywhere. And that has never been truer. We can try to be logical during this pandemic as we innovate and as we run businesses and as we oversee brands, or we can sit there and we can actually say, this is the opportunity we've all been waiting for to innovate more rapidly and more disruptively than ever before. So I could go on for a lot longer than this. Most of our keynotes, admittedly, are an hour or even longer because we have so much rich content. And this is obviously a fairly unfamiliar format for me, as I think it is for many of you. You know, we're all still getting adjusted to these new realities. I wanted to leave a few minutes for Q&A. I will ultimately defer to Irina as to whether we have that time, but I also want to keep the line of communication open to all of you. I don't just like to come in and present some topics, some of which are very, very dense, and then walk away. So I would encourage all of you, and I can circulate this or have Irina circulate it afterwards, to reach out to me. My contact information is just my first name, Jared, Jared, at thefuturehunters.com. So if any of you have follow-up questions, want to talk more about this, or tap my brain about other topics, I make myself available to do that. So Irina, thank you for bearing with me again. There's so much to talk about here, but while these are scary and daunting times for all of us, this is, to me, one of the most hopeful times that we have ever seen, and the opportunities are endless. I am excited for all of you, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here. So thank you, Irina. I do. I mean, I think, you know, all of you on this call today know as much, if not more than I do, about the sort of legacy of the beauty industry, that the beauty industry is one of those industries that seems to be more resilient than several others as far as being able to rebound, which is the title of your event, from disruptive economic circumstances. And I think that the beauty industry is one of the industries, and I'm not just saying this because I'm on this call today with you, but I think the beauty industry is one of the industries that will once again prove resilient. And that's for a variety of reasons. I don't have to go through the laundry list of those. Many of you are aware of those. But I think that, you know, what's happening today, it's so interesting. I've already talked on this call a little bit about the changing nature of social influence. And obviously, beauty is at the center. It's one of the few industries that's at the center of online and social influence and digital creators and the areas that they play in. So when we see that evolving the way it is, there are a lot of exciting opportunities there. Now, again, we can question the role of some pre-existing social influencers, but the flip side to that is I think you're going to have millions more people who are going to be content creators in a space that either is directly impacting what you do or touches on it in some adjacency. Now, you asked about retail. Retail is going to be permanently disrupted. Many retailers have already declared bankruptcy and gone out of business. I think the retail sector has resisted for years the necessity of, in many ways, making their processes more efficient and also automating them, but also fully surrendering to a future that is going to be experiential retail. So retail is going to be less about commerce in the physical retail space, and it's going to be more about experience. And as we integrate virtual reality, augmented reality, and all of these other technologies that used to be considered more theoretical, we realize that we can make retail experiential, and we can make it something which has much more of an impact on people's lives, not just in store, but out of store as well. This ecosystem is evolving rapidly. Look, if I were speaking to a consortium of retailers here, obviously the messaging is not always that positive because a lot of retailers will go out of business. There will be consolidation. It's as simple as that. This is Darwinian, what we are living through right now. So the losers will go out of business, but the winners are going to emerge from this being stronger than ever before. So what you just asked could be the platform for an entire hour-long presentation. So as I said, while my time is basically up here today, I just want you to know that I make myself available for follow-up conversations about any of this because I think it's that important.